I took a moment and looked up the definition of the word affinity. And it said a feeling of closeness or understanding that someone has for another person or something because of their similar qualities, ideas, or interests. And in our vSphere environment, it's very likely that we're going to have some virtual machines that are very well suited to run together, meaning it'd be a great idea if we could have those two virtual machines run on the same ESX host. And let's talk about an example of that. Let's say these two virtual machines have tons of communications that go back and forth. It's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, all the traffic between these two VMs, if they're on the same ESXi host and on the same subnet, that traffic is all going to stay inside that ESXi host. However, if we moved, for example, VM2 over to ESX2, and VM1 and VM2 had a lot of traffic to send to each other, that traffic has to go over the physical network to go between the two ESXi hosts that are running the respective VM1 and VM2. So we know a couple things already. First of all, we know that we can do vMotion between two ESXi hosts to move a virtual machine back and forth wherever it needs to go. Secondly, we know that by introducing a cluster and by using DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, that we can have the system, DRS specifically, automatically move virtual machines between ESXi hosts based on load. And the next piece, which is affinity rules, plays right into that. We can also tell DRS that, oh, by the way, besides just considering load, we'd also like you to consider the fact that we would like these two machines, for example, to run together on the same ESXi host. And under the settings for the cluster, there's an option for setting up some rules for affinity. So we can tell the cluster we want to keep certain VMs together. And as a parent, I also realize that it's sometimes important to keep two systems or two individuals apart. And with our affinity rules, we can also specify that we want to go ahead and separate virtual machines. Let's say, for example, VM number 3 and VM number 5, they're going to have very high CPU utilization, and we want to move them to separate physical ESXi hosts and make sure they're separate from each other. And so if we had 10 ESXi hosts in the cluster, and we said, please keep VM3 and VM5 separate, because we have 10 ESXi hosts to choose from, it would just make sure that VM3 and VM5 ended up on separate physical ESXi hosts. So these first two are all about grouping or separating individual VMs. We also have the ability to set up affinity between virtual machines and the actual ESXi host that they're going to be running on. And to do that, we're going to create something called groups. And so we can have groups of VMs. For example, this is group A, and this is group B. And let's add ESX3 and ESX4, just so we have some more ESX hosts to play with. And we could put ESX1 and ESX2 into a DRS group of hosts. And we could group ESX3 and ESX4 into a group of hosts. We could then set up affinity rules. For example, we could say we want the virtual machines that are part of the VM group called B to run on hosts that are in the host group called Y. And as part of DRS's decision-making process, it would look at that rule to make sure that these three virtual machines got on one of these ESXi hosts based on the affinity rules that we had set up. We also have the option of saying we don't want to run specific VM groups on specific ESXi host groups. And as an example, if these are the current groups that we have in place, and we set up a rule that says do not run any VMs in the VM group called A on any ESXi host in the host group of Y, it would avoid putting VM1 or VM2 on ESX3 or ESX4. And for the affinity between virtual machines and specific ESXi host groups, we have some options. We have a must option. And if we use the option of must, it says this has to happen. This VM group must run on the ESXi host group of Y. Or conversely, this VM group must not run on this ESXi host group. And there's another option that I call please. And with the should option, it means if it's possible, please make it happen. But if it's not, don't prevent the virtual machines from coming up at all. It's also possible to have a virtual machine that's in multiple VM groups. We could also have ESX2 and ESX3 in the host group called Z. And as you can imagine, there could be some conflicts. And if we are creating a rule and there's a conflict, the system will warn us and say, whoa, there's a conflict with this rule. I'm going to go ahead and disable it. I'll tell you I'm disabling it, says the system. And if you want to go back and modify some of your existing rules so there's no longer a conflict, that's great. In this nugget, we've taken a look at some of the concepts of affinity rules, including the fact that we can use these to influence virtual machines that should or should not run on the same exact ESXi host as each other. We also identified that we can set up affinity rules for a specific virtual machine or group of VMs so that they run on a specific ESXi host. And that way we can control where those VMs are going to run when they're running in vSphere. In our next nugget, we'll take a look at the implementation of affinity rules in a vSphere environment. Until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.